African American schools towards the end of the Civil War and during Reconstruction contained suffering at every level, whether it was lack of funding, the students and teachers fighting poverty, or violent threats towards the schools. The combination of these factors made building schools for the newly freed slaves more challenging than originally expected. But despite these challenges, African Americans were determined to attend school. Teacher Laura Town in the Sea Islands of South Carolina stated, "Their steady eagerness to learn is just something amazing. To be deprived of a lesson is a severe punishment." The first major obstacle Black schools in the South faced was funding. These schools received the majority of their funding from the Freedmen's Bureau, Northern Charities, Northern Missionary Societies, and donations from the local communities. In the poorest regions, parents were forced to build their own schools, raise money through fundraisers, buy their own textbooks, and feed and board and protect the teachers. Because of this, many schools were forced to close their doors. Booker T. Washington describes that some of the early schoolhouses consisted of 4 pieces of timber driven into the ground and brush spread overhead as a covering to keep out the sun and rain. The Freedmen Bureaus provided the largest portion of funding to Black schools. According to Ronald Butchart, they rented buildings for school rooms, provided books and transportation for teachers, superintended the schools, and offered military protection for students and teachers against the opponents of Black literacy. Unfortunately, though, they could never meet the high demands of the Black community. By the end of Reconstruction, there only stood 125 Black schools in the South. This shortage of schools led to extremely large class sizes, especially in the cities. Esther Douglas, a teacher in Savannah, Georgia, in 1865, had a 16 by 17 room, sometimes packed with 90 or more students. Douglas explained her students as 120 dirty, half-naked, perfectly wild Black children crowded on the floor. Poverty also proved an obstacle for these schools, as most of the Black students lived in poverty. Teacher Mary Ames wrote in her diary that poverty placed such a burden on her students that it was difficult for many to survive, let alone go to school. Teacher Laura Town describes in her letters that her students had little food and all wore old clothes. Absentees were normal during the school year, especially in the winter, when illness spread fast. Students lacked warm clothes or shoes, and drafty schools did not provide enough protection from the elements. Memories of slavery also placed another burden on the children. Historian Jacqueline Jones describes, "Slavery left its mark on the children and conditioned their responses to white authority figures. The pupils deeply feared physical punishment." Ames wrote that many of her students wore scars from when they had been whipped as slaves. But despite these disadvantages, students still wished to educate themselves. Teachers of Southern Black schools faced many hardships too. Northern teachers coming to the South did not receive warm welcomes. Ames wrote in her diary that community members looked at her with disgust or just ignored her. And upon arrival, she was forced to sleep on the floorboards since no accommodations were made for her. Many teachers lived in poverty, with Black teachers facing the worst. Some white communities refused housing to the homeless teachers. Other communities went as far as banning teachers of African American schools in certain areas of town. There are exceptions, though. Northern teachers of the American Missionary Association lived better lives in the cities where they had cooks and comfortable homes. The rural areas is where teachers face the most hardships of poverty and harassment. But whether from the North or South, all teachers face some type of opposition. The largest opposition schools faced stood as threats from white members of the community who opposed Black education. There are numerous incidents of violence towards teachers, students, and schoolhouses throughout Reconstruction. Quaker teacher Eunice Congdon was attacked and almost killed. In North Carolina, another incident occurred where a white man tried to kill a Northern teacher by sending a savage dog on her. Alfred Morris closed his school in North Carolina only after 6 weeks due to, as he quoted, his apprehensive to his safety. Students also faced similar violent attacks. Between the 1960s and 1970s, hundreds of Black schoolhouses were burned to the ground. Teachers' homes were broken into, shot at, stoned, or set aflame. Riots in Memphis in 1865 and New Orleans 1866 destroyed many schools, churches, and homes. Some historians claim teachers brought this violence upon themselves, but this is not true. Southern white resistance was fueled by white supremacy. This terrorism on Black education had been occurring for a long time, but gained strength with the significant rise of Black education throughout Reconstruction. Many Southern whites opposed black schools because they believed the schools threatened white supremacy. They also believed the teachers threatened Southern customs and traditions. These attacks were not an education, they were an attack on black freedom. The South lost the Civil War, but they refused to lose the battle against white supremacy. Once the South realized black education was there to stay, they took control of the system by deporting Northern teachers, creating their own segregated schools, and by attacking black schools' funding, but often providing 30 times more funding for white schools. The Civil War did not prove to be the end of the civil rights issues for the newly freed slaves in America, or the end of white supremacy, as seen through the struggles of education in the South. Even though African Americans owned their freedom, they did not receive true equality and struggled to create their own schools. Schools would receive improved funding as the years went on, but it would take another 80 years to legally end segregation and provide equal opportunities. To say civil rights improved with each passing year would be a lie, but every struggle has a beginning, and it's the people like these teachers and the African American students that fought for change who make a difference and change the future.